Welcome back to Campaigns and Elections. What we're going to talk about right now is American federalism, and what I want to do with this segment is to provide a link between the number and types of governments that we looked at in the last segment and what we're going to be doing after this, which is to talk about election rules in the United States and what those look like, how they work, what kinds of offices use different kinds of election rules. To put that in perspective, I thought it would be useful to spend a little bit of time talking about the pattern of federalism in the United States and how that has developed over time in this country, and to use that discussion as a jumping off point to talk about the variation in electoral systems, because we're going to use that in turn to talk about the demands on voters as they think about candidates, the way in which parties and candidates themselves try to run for office, try to mount campaigns to be elected. The paper that I've assigned for this segment is this really very nice piece by Hogan Marks that describes two types of federalisms, and what's interesting is we have both of these in the United States. They developed side by side, but I think it'll be helpful in thinking about the kinds of electoral systems that we have here to use Hogan Marks to help us put that in perspective. At the end of this, there's a self-assessment for you to do. It's the first of several over the course in this class. Let me take a moment and talk about the ground rules of these self-assessments. These are not exams. They are more like quizzes, but the goal is for you to get 100%. The items that you're going to see on this self-assessment, as well as the others, are things that really get at the core of the arguments. I'm not looking for names and dates. I want you to get the main concepts, the main arguments that we're looking at, and what this means for you is that you're getting the material, that you're reading the assigned readings, and you're listening to these video clips with me lecturing in ways that are helping you grasp what I take to be the main points. So the way this works is you should get 100%. If you're doing the reading well and you're listening and taking notes well, you'll have no trouble getting 100% on these. These are open book, open note, unlimited time, but the way in which they're assessed is that we will count the number of times that it takes you to get to 100%. Hopefully, if you've done the reading well and you're not guessing, you really have delved into the material, you'll get 100% on the first try, in which case you get the full set of points on the self-assessment. If it takes you 2 tries to get to 100%, then you'll lose 1 point, and you lose another point for each time through it takes you, each pass through the self-assessment before you get to 100%. So that's the ground rules for the self-assessments, this one as well as the others. But after you've gone through and made notes from what I talk about now, and you read carefully the Hogan Marks piece, you should be well positioned to go ahead and take the first of the self-assessments. What I want to dwell on for a little bit is federalisms that exist in the United States, and I use that term in the plural intentionally. We have two very different types of federalisms that coexist with one another here in the United States. And as I suggested before, they grew up more or less simultaneously. The background here on the types of federalism is one about the history of the United States. Right from the outset, when the framers of the Constitution were trying to figure out how to design a federal government that would work, they had arrived at a conclusion that was inescapable, that the system of government that they had designed coming out of the Revolutionary War was failing and leaving the country at great risk. We had won the Revolutionary War, but we had not permanently insulated this new country from the threats of the European powers, most especially Britain, but also the other major European powers that were looking at this new world as a great prize. It was a land filled with natural resources and hardworking people that meant that it was an enormous prize that if it could be taken over by one of these European powers, would make those powers very wealthy. So they had to design a system of government. We talked about the design of the Constitution. At the time the Constitution was written, there were already a set of vibrant state governments that had been the colonies that had come together to fight in the Revolutionary War. These state governments in turn had a rich tradition of local governance, of local authorities at the county level and municipal governments, and these were places where people had a sense of how they could govern themselves. So from the very beginning, there was a sense that the new government would have to be based upon and build from these pre-existing state governments. There was never a sense in the United States by very many of the framers. There were some exceptions, but by and large the framers never really seriously entertained the possibility of designing a unitary government, a central government without local or regional governments that had their own authorities and autonomy. A unitary government would be one where all power would emanate from the national capital, and any regional or local authorities would simply be administrative units. This was never really seriously entertained as a possibility in the United States. In part, this was because they had just come through a searing experience of fighting a long, very difficult and very costly in terms of people's lives and property, a long war to get rid of a unitary government, to be free of the burdens of a monarchy, King George. They viewed unitary governments as a danger to the citizenry. So this was never really entertained by very many of the people who were thinking about the design of the new country. And that's reflected in the authorities that were reserved to the state and to the people. The Constitution was a document that, at least in its original form, and a form that has been questioned more recently, but in its original form, that was viewed as a limiting document that gave the new national government some explicit authorities, but only those authorities that were explicitly laid out in the Constitution. Everything else would be reserved to the states and to the people. There was another reason for not wanting a unitary government, besides the danger that it imposed to the citizenry, and this is an argument that is in Hogan Marx very explicitly, and that is that unitary governments are insensitive to scale efficiencies. That is, to the kinds of things that different governments can do better because they are closer to the people and can better understand the particular needs that exist in a given area. Unitary governments are well suited for some scale efficiencies, things that exist at the national level, like national defense, dealing with currency and financial systems and so forth, issues of immigration, but they are less helpful in dealing with, or less useful in dealing with, issues that are really fairly local or regional in scale. So think about the contrast between national defense, which is something that we assume will be handled by the national government, and things like hiking and biking trails and open space here in Boulder. It would be absurd to think that a unitary government, off in Washington, D.C., for example, could deal with all of the various claimants that have arguments about how the open space and the trails should be used. Do we really want people having to go off to Washington to say dogs on leash or dogs off leash, mountain bikes, but not if they have knobby tires, or only if the trails are sufficiently dry or not angled up too steeply? It would be inefficient. It is an understatement to think about having to send people off, delegations from Boulder to Washington, D.C. to talk about how this land should be made available to different user groups from Boulder. That's the sort of thing where there's a scale efficiency that lends itself to a local government dealing with these kinds of things. So what Hoag and Marx tell us is that all systems of federalism, and they're going to talk about two basic types, but that all systems of federalism allow a dispersion of authority that creates flexibility in public policy. They're really focused on the public policy side of how things get implemented. From the point of view of the framers of the Constitution, the dispersion of authority also had the salubrious effect of dividing power, so that the government didn't become a threat to its own people, something which they rightly feared, having seen the threat that the crown, the monarchy, posed to them. They understood that unitary government could be a threat to the citizens. Well, let me jump right into the Hoag and Marx piece, run through these two types of federalism, and then use that to set up a discussion of electoral rules. So what are these two types of federalism? The United States has both. Both coexist and create strengths and problems for one another. To the points that I want to make about the systems of federalism are not about federalism per se, although I'll talk about those, but I want to use this as a way of talking about how our federalisms that exist in the United States create issues that we need to think about in terms of campaigns and elections. So that's why I'm talking about this. Well, what are the two types? Type 1, I wish Hoag and Marx had more elegant terms, more descriptive terms. They don't. They call them type 1 and type 2. By type 1, what they mean is a kind of system-wide architecture. What might be thought of as kind of a layer cake model of distribution of authority, where there's a very limited number of levels. The jurisdictions that exist at those levels are general purpose governments. That is, they're responsible for more or less all of the key things that happen in their territories, and over which they have some special set of designated responsibilities, I should say. These governments are non-intersecting, and they fully exhaust the landmass, the territory. So you can think about the 50 states and the District of Columbia fully exhaust the landmass of the United States. There's no part of the United States proper that isn't in one of those states or the District of Columbia. Before statehood for places like Colorado and Wyoming, Arizona, and so forth, there were territories that had another legal status that fully exhausted the space that wasn't in states, and those territories had lesser authorities and more reliance on the federal government to carry out things. But this is a kind of a comprehensive and exhaustive set of governments that are going to fully cover the whole territory of the country. This kind of a system-wide architecture is always intentional. There's a self-conscious plan. That self-conscious plan is typically embodied in supreme laws, what we here in the United States call constitutions, and these plans are the product of intentionality, and they are very, very durable, extremely durable. We don't have many examples of states being split off from other states, of counties subdividing. You can find a few historical examples of this sort of thing. The last time a state was carved out of a pre-existing state, not out of a territory where the presumption was that once there were enough people and the territory had met appropriate litmus tests that it could become a state. That was very orderly and part of this plan. But the last example of a state being carved out of another state was actually during the Civil War, when West Virginia was carved out of the state of Virginia, and it was done for strategic reasons by the Union to protect assets and access basically to Washington, D.C. That was a long time ago, and it was during the emergency of the Civil War. Even at the county level, we don't see counties coming and going, certainly not very often. Colorado actually has somewhat more flexible rules about formation of counties than most states, but even here it's a rare thing, and the main way in which counties differ in Colorado is that there are the two counties that are combined city and county governments, Denver and Broomfield. So the point here is that Type 1 governments are intentional, durable, and self-conscious. It's a system-wide kind of architecture. Type 2 goes by a lot of different kinds of names. The one that I usually use, didn't come up with this myself, is polycentricity, which is not all that elegant itself. Type 2 governments are, it's a messier system. Type 2 jurisdictions are the task-specific kinds of governments that have flourished in the United States. And if recall from that chart before, that Type 2 governments are numerically the roster of governments, the special districts and school districts. These governments are much easier to form. They spring up to deal with problems that general purpose governments have trouble solving, or where general purpose government officials don't have the expertise, where people need to really focus full-time on a particular problem or set of issues, like the education of children, or managing electric utilities, dealing with transportation demands in a regional area, running airports, dealing with air pollution in air pollution zones like in Southern California, or in other air sheds, they're sometimes called. Type 2 governments, there's really no limit to the number of these things. The rules for them being created vary from state to state, but in general, every state allows these governments to come into existence and to go out of existence. Often these are used to solve problems that come from the difficulties that the Type 1 governments, the general purpose governments, have in coordinating their behaviors. So for example, where general purpose governments share a border that is a river or a harbor or a big lake like the Great Lakes, they may have trouble coordinating their behaviors and need help with that, and they may form a special district to do some of those kinds of things. I'm going to talk and plug in my computer at the same time because it's warning me that I'm running out of power. But I can keep talking at the same time. We'll see if I can do two things at once. The problems of coordination are common in all types of federalism, and that's because power is dispersed. In that sense, federalism works. It disperses power. At the same time, that dispersion of power means that there are issues at the boundaries between governments where there are spillovers. Those are called externalities. Sometimes those are positive, sometimes those are negative, like air pollution. Positive externalities are things like economic development that increases job opportunities and tax revenues and so forth for governments in a region if there's some development activity in any one of those governments, because people are living in the other jurisdictions, tends to lift the boats, as it were, in all of those different governments in the area. How do governments in federal systems coordinate their behaviors? They do this basically through two mechanisms. And this gets us directly into the issue of campaigns and elections. The two ways are voice and exit. A voice means to make an explicit claim on that government, to ask it to do things. And the main source of voice is elections. There are other things like protests and writing letter campaigns and that sort of thing. But by and large, the main way in which voice is expressed is through the voters speaking at the ballot box. All of the general purpose governments have elections. Virtually all of the special districts have elections. But the kinds of election rules that are used are as varied as the different types of governments that exist out there. The same kind of flexibility that allows the creation of the Type 2 governments in particular also allow for flexibility in the design of the election rules that are used in those governments. So voice is the main way that that people express their preferences on these governments, and so we're going to come back to that point in just a moment. The other is exit. Exit means to leave a government. With the system-wide architecture, the way exit is expressed is by physically relocating, by saying, I've had it, I don't want to live in that kind of place, I'm going to move to another place where I won't be under the authority of that government. I'm not going to pay taxes to it, I don't want to deal with its public officials, I don't trust its police officers, I don't think the fire department will come and put out a fire in my house. Those kinds of sentiments lead people to say, okay, I'm going to move to another place. Moving is costly. It happens because we're a mobile society, and so there are opportunities for people to relocate from one city to another city. There are some classic examples where cities have dramatically lost population over time as people have relocated. Detroit, perhaps, is the quintessential example of this, where people moved not out of Michigan so much, but from, though some did, but from Detroit to various communities that were on the boundaries of Detroit. There are people who want to live in Boulder, people that want to live in Louisville, that want to live in Longmont. They don't want to live in the other communities for one reason or another. But that kind of exit requires people getting up and moving. The other kind of exit is where you basically fire the government. Now think about that for a moment. We don't think about firing a government. But with Type 2 governments, that happens. Many of the Type 2 governments are formed by other governments. They created the special districts, regional transportation district. If the people in a particular place have had it with that special district, then there are often mechanisms by which the people in that community can force the issue and take their community out of the special district, or can lead can engage in behaviors that lead to the dissolution of that government. So they basically are sending it a termination notice. We don't want you anymore. So exit it takes on more different kinds of roles in dealing with Type 2 governments. How is that expressed in Type 2 governments? One of the ways, not the only way obviously, but one of the ways is through the ballot box itself. So kind of a roundabout way for voice. There are mechanisms for direct democracy, which we'll talk about in just a few days, where people put on the ballot issues, measures that often constrain what governments can do, that remove the ability of governments to tax, at least at the level they were before, and may take a community out of one of these kinds of special district governments. Now, I'm gonna put this back in the context of campaigns and elections in a very explicit sort of way for you. What are the big takeaway points? I want to point to two big implications about campaigns and elections that are directly derivable from this discussion of the types of federalisms that have flourished in the American context. One of these is that American voters do more than most voters around the world. And that's because our ballots and the opportunity to vote on ballots is far greater and more complex in the United States than almost anywhere else. We'll look at some ballots later on, but let me just kind of suggest to you what that's going to look like. When you look at a whole ballot, say here in Boulder County, you'll start with the federal elections, president or senate, congressional seat, then the statewide offices, governor and secretary of state, and the other statewide officials that we elect, and then we'll have things like the regents elections. That's a statewide set of elections to elect the regents that run the University of Colorado. And then there are county elections, there are city elections, there are special district elections, including for the school board, but also other special districts that may exist, some in Boulder, the city of Boulder, and others that exist in the county outside the city and in the other cities in Boulder County like Louisville and Longmont. So those kinds of things. In addition to those, there are initiatives and referenda that people are voting on. These are the direct democracy measures. We also have votes on judges in Colorado, which are called retention elections. We don't vote to elect judges to office. The governor appoints judges to office for the state judiciary, but after they are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the state senate, then periodically we as voters have opportunities to throw them out of office. Those are called retention elections. So the first implication I want to draw your attention to is that the complexity of governments leads to complexity of ballots. And that means that voters have very high demands on their ability to get information, to think through what they want, and to then cast their votes to express their preferences. The second implication is that we have great complexity of electoral rules. The flexibility, the fluidity of our system of governance is reflected in the complexity of the election rules. So when we go and vote, it's often the case that what it's going to take to win may be very different in one set of things on which we're voting than it is on another set of things that we're voting. So it's a little bit like going to a football game and watching a basketball game on the big screen and watching a baseball game on your iPod, and trying to keep up with all of those simultaneously with minimal time to redirect your attention from one to the other. The electoral rules mean that there are different kinds of games that are being played, and I don't mean games in a little sense. I mean games in the sense that we have a situation that's defined by rules and the strategies of the actors that are operating there. So, what's the big picture? The big picture here is that there's a mirroring from the complexity of governments that gets reflected in the complexity of electoral systems in the United States. We don't have one election system. We have scores of election systems. The fluidity in the design of governments is itself reflected in the fluidity in the design of electoral rules. So the rules that are used today may be different than they were just 10 years or 15 years ago, and will be different than the rules that we're going to be operating under, at least for some of these governments, in just a few years from now. I don't know how they'll differ, but I can guarantee you that given the flexibility in designing governments, that same flexibility exists in the design of the electoral rules, and that means that there will be changes in at least some of those kinds of things. What does this mean for a class on campaigns and elections? Well, it means the United States is a fabulous it's a fabulous laboratory for studying campaigns and elections. Think about it for a moment. This means that we can study almost every kind of electoral system that's out there. We can study strategies of campaigns, of candidates running under very different kinds of rules, at the same time holding constant a whole lot of variables about culture, history, religion, ethnicity, those kinds of things. We can look at voters and ask, how are voters making these calculations? How do they arrive at decisions, not just about whether they're going to support the Democrat or the Republican in a presidential race, but how are they going to vote in a nonpartisan race? How are they going to vote in a direct democracy election where it's not Democrats versus Republicans, it's a policy question? And are they really going to vote or not? And if so, are they going to vote on the whole ballot, or are they going to vote for just some of the items that are on the ballot and not other kinds of things? So we're going to jump into electoral rules. First, we'll talk about electoral rules kind of in the abstract at a theoretical level, and then we'll have a segment on different kinds of rules that are used in elections that you're going to be familiar with, and some that perhaps you'll be less familiar with. So here's what you should do. Read Hogan Marks if you haven't already. Read it carefully. Take the self-assessment. Print out the article. Have it with you. I want you to get the key points. I'm not really interested at this point in the whole grading enterprise. I want you to get 100%. I want you to get 100% on the first try, because that means that you're getting it. You're grasping the key concepts. What we will do next is to jump into this richness of electoral systems in the United States and how they work. So So take the self-assessment, and then we'll get right back together, and we'll talk about electoral systems and how we use them here in the United States.